The lab report was only 2 pages long, but the words in the conclusion box effectively terminated my life as I knew it. It didn't say bear, wolf, or human. It read, taxon, unknown primate. Behind that name lies a ghost lineage the government has been scrubbing from history for 50 years, and I just found the first piece of physical proof. It felt as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. I have seen grizzlies peel the bark off a larch tree like an orange, but the ridge at the north wall felt different, untouched, heavy, and deliberately avoided. The terrain here is a jagged spine of granite and subalpine fir in permanent shadow. My analog field watch, a machine that has not failed me in 15 years, stopped moving at exactly 10:14 in the morning. As I pushed deeper into the timber, the trees began to change. I found young cedar saplings twisted and wrung like wet towels, the breaks occurring 8 feet off the ground. No windstorm snaps wood with that kind of precision. I knelt in the soft needles, finding massive depressions in the earth that had been carefully brushed over to obscure their shape. A cold bead of sweat rolled down my spine as I realized I was not just tracking something. I was being guided into a territory where the rules of biology no longer applied. Somewhere in the limestone crevices above, a shadow moved against the grey stone, a silhouette too large to be a man and too upright to be a bear. Nature does not construct in right angles, and it certainly does not weave living cedar branches into a cathedral of thorns. I found it tucked into a limestone crevice, a structure that looked less like a nest and more like a fortress, built with an impossible strength. The scent of wet copper and old musk grew stronger in the cold air. Branches as thick as my forearm had been braided together with such deliberate force that they seemed to fuse into an impenetrable wall. The opening was a jagged tear, revealing an interior that was both dark and surprisingly vast, a dome of living wood growing out of the rock itself. It was hidden, perfectly camouflaged against the grey stone and deep green firs. Inside, the light barely penetrated, but I could make out a floor matted with coarse, dark fur. In the center lay a partially consumed elk femur, stripped clean by something that scraped and ground. On that bone was a thick, translucent coating of biological fluid. This was not a harvest site, it was a dining room, and whatever ate here was not just a beast, but something with a disturbing intelligence. That is when I saw it. A single, coarse hair, long and silver black, caught in the sticky sap. It was thick as wire, shimmering with an unnatural sheen. I knew then that I had found something that would shatter our understanding of the natural world. My hands were shaking as I pulled the sterile vial from my pack. On that chewed elk femur, the biological coating was remarkably fresh. It was as if the inhabitant had sensed my approach and retreated only seconds before I stepped into the shadows. I worked with the precision of a crime scene investigator, swabbing the viscous material, the physical proof I needed. As I moved, the air inside the nest felt heavy, vibrating with a low-frequency hum I felt in my teeth. I carefully placed that single 14-inch silver-black hair into a separate glass tube, noting its metallic luster under my penlight. Every movement felt like a transgression of a sanctuary that had remained unobserved for generations. I could smell the creature now, a complex scent, part primal animal and part something eerily close to the sweat of a human being. Just as I sealed the container, the light in the cave entrance flickered. A mass passed between the sun and the opening, momentarily casting the interior into total darkness. I held my breath, listening. Instead of a step, I heard a long, rattling huff of air, a slow exhale that carried the heat of a massive set of lungs. Whatever had left this fluid behind was no longer just a ghost. It was standing just beyond the threshold, and it knew exactly what I had taken. I heard the first whistle a mile from the ridge, a high-pitched, oscillating sound that bypassed my ears and vibrated directly in my chest. It was not the call of a bird, nor the signal of a human hunter. It was a rhythmic, piercing frequency that rippled through the fabric of the forest. I began my descent with the vials tucked against my skin, my heart hammering against the evidence I now carried. The hike back became a harrowing game of shadows. Every time I adjusted my pace, the heavy footfalls in the underbrush to my left adjusted with me, keeping a perfect, synchronized distance. I reached for my self-defense tool as the sun dipped, but when I clicked the switch, the bulb merely flickered and failed. The batteries were fresh, yet the device remained cold and useless, leaving me to navigate the treacherous granite wash by the silver ghost of the moon. I could feel the heat of something massive tracking me from the tree line, an escort ensuring I left. Large branches snapped with the force of a blasted projectile, a clear message of power echoing through the timber. I finally reached the gravel turnout where my vehicle sat, a lonely island of steel. As I fumbled for my keys, the whistling stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like physical pressure. I caught the glint of two amber reflections high in the brush before they vanished. I was safe for now, but the forest felt fundamentally altered, as if the mountain had marked me as the bearer of its greatest secret. My friend Sarah, a senior geneticist, looked absolutely terrified when she called me into the laboratory 3 days later. The sterile, fluorescent hum of the facility felt like the backdrop to a high-stakes interrogation. Sarah sat me down in front of a monitor, displaying a complex series of jagged data bands. She explained that the amplification had failed twice because the biological material was too dense, containing an organic complexity she had never encountered in 20 years. When the third attempt finally yielded a result, the software flagged the file for an immediate security review. She showed me the preliminary data: 98% hominid. On the surface, it looked human, but the remaining 2% was a sequence of base pairs that did not exist in any known global database. It was not a contamination. It was a ghost lineage that should have passed from existence 60,000 years ago. Sarah lowered her voice, telling me the saliva contained unique enzymes for breaking down raw bone marrow, a trait absent in modern humans. As we spoke, a notification flashed on her terminal. The data had been automatically uploaded to a remote federal server. Sarah's hands were trembling as she handed me a hard copy of the findings, her eyes pleading with me to leave before the digital trail caught up with us. The official document was only 2 pages long, but the words printed in the conclusion box changed the trajectory of my life forever. It did not categorize the sample as a bear or a wolf. Instead, the bold lettering read, "Taxon, unknown primate. Recommendation, immediate federal notification." I sat in my truck, the engine idling, staring at the physical manifestation of my discovery. The report detailed a physiological anomaly that felt like a bridge to an ancient world. It noted that the mitochondrial DNA was incredibly resilient, suggesting a species that had adapted to extreme high-altitude environments in total isolation for millennia. Most unsettling was the enzyme structure, which indicated a metabolic rate far beyond any known great ape. As I read, I realized that Sarah's lab had unknowingly tripped a silent alarm. The document mentioned that because the sequence fell under the select agent classification, The data had been sequestered by a department I had never heard of. To the authorities, this was a threat to be contained, but to me, it was a living, breathing soul that deserved to remain in the shadows. I pulled away from the curb, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of a tail. I pulled into my driveway just as the sun dipped, finding a black SUV with no license plates idling near my porch. Two men stepped out as I cut my ignition, their movements synchronized and professional. They wore no insignia, yet they carried the unmistakable aura of federal authority. One of them, a man with eyes as cold as a mountain lake, informed me they were conducting a routine sweep due to a reported biological hazard. When I finally entered my home, I found my life had been meticulously disassembled. My books were off the shelves, my computer had been mirrored, and my tracking gear lay scattered. They were searching for the physical vials and the lab report that had already been flagged on their servers. They did not speak much, but their silence was intimidating. They knew exactly where I'd been, down to the longitudinal coordinates of the limestone nest. As they finally retreated, the man with the cold eyes lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on my backpack. He knew I was holding back, and I knew that my home was no longer a sanctuary, but a monitored cage. The hunt for the unknown primate had transitioned from a scientific curiosity to a high-stakes game of survival. I went back to the ridge with a military-grade thermal array and waited for the mountain to wake up. For hours, the monitor showed nothing but the cold silhouettes of granite and fir. Then, at exactly 2:32 in the morning, the screen erupted. A massive heat signature, topping 105 degrees, began to emerge directly from the floor of the limestone crevice. I watched in stunned silence as a figure of immense proportions materialized, its thermal footprint far exceeding that of any grizzly I'd ever tracked. It moved with a fluid, upright grace, its shoulders broad enough to fill the entire entrance of the nest. As it stepped fully into the open, a secondary, smaller heat signature followed close behind. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The nest was not just a shelter, it was a chimney for a deeper, subterranean cave system that bypassed the frozen surface of the ridge. These creatures were living within the very bones of the mountain, utilizing geothermal heat to remain undetected. I was looking at a hidden civilization, and the thermal sensor had just provided a window into a world never meant to be seen. It started with 3 stones placed in a triangle on the hood of my truck. Then came the knocks, rhythmic, purposeful strikes against the lodgepole pines that sounded like a heavy iron sledgehammer hitting an anvil. These were not random sounds. They were a calculated form of communication directed at me. I found complex glyphs constructed from living willow twigs, bent into shapes that suggested a sophisticated grasp of geometry. One arrangement featured a circle of stones with a single branch pointing toward the valley below, where the black SUVs were stationed. These creatures were monitoring the outsiders who were tracking me. They were using the landscape as a chalkboard, warning me of the encroaching threat with an ancient intelligence. As I followed a trail of these markers, the frequency of the tree knocks changed. They were circling me, a percussion that seemed to vibrate in my marrow. The creature was communicating a boundary. Near the edge of a steep ravine, I found a pile of bleached bones, arranged to mimic the shape of the limestone ridge. It was a clear, unmistakable map. But as I turned to leave, I saw a new set of prints that had not been there 5 minutes before, overlapping my own. They were letting me know that while I was studying their language, they had already mastered mine. The black vehicles returned to the base of the ridge, with heavy crates and specialized containment gear. They were moving toward the limestone nest with the terrifying efficiency of a military strike team. I watched through my spotting scope as they deployed acoustic emitters, devices meant to drive any living thing out of the subterranean crevices with high-frequency sound waves. The atmosphere grew thick with an unnatural pressure as the machines hummed to life. But as the first plumes of gas were pumped into the mouth of the nest, the mountain itself seemed to reject the intrusion. A sudden, localized tremor rippled through the granite, an earthquake so precise it targeted only the ground where the extraction team stood. The heavy equipment groaned and tilted as the soil liquefied, and a low, guttural vibration rose from the depths, a sound that was the collective resonance of something deep within the earth. In the ensuing chaos, the primary containment crate was crushed by a falling fir tree, its contents spilling uselessly into the mud. The strike team scrambled to retreat as the ridge began to swallow their footprints, the forest reclaiming its silence with a violent, possessive force. Through the dust and falling needles, I saw that the breach had achieved one thing. The creatures were no longer staying underground. I was hunkered down in a granite wash when the lightning flashed, illuminating the world in a harsh, electric white. 10 feet away, standing perfectly still, was a face that looked like a distorted, ancient mirror of my own. It did not possess the vacant gaze of a beast. Instead, the eyes were filled with a profound, weary intelligence. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, its frame draped in hair that looked like liquid obsidian under the driving rain. Despite its size, it made no sound. We remained locked in that silent exchange as the thunder rolled across the north wall, a moment where the boundary between species simply ceased to exist. I saw the silver-black hair I had sampled earlier, now plastered against a brow that was undeniably expressive. There was no aggression in its stance, only a crushing sense of grief and a quiet, persistent warning. As the next flash of light struck the ridge, the creature raised a massive, 5-fingered hand and placed a single digit against its lips in a gesture that was unmistakably human. "Hush," it seemed to say, without uttering a word. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the silhouette dissolved back into the shadows. I realized then that the government agents were not just hunting a primate. They were attempting to cage a soul that had outlasted every empire of man. In the mud where it stood, the creature had left a path leading deeper into the heart of the stone. Following the path led me into a cavern system that USGS maps insisted did not exist. The walls were covered in layers of mineral deposits, etched with the history of a people who forgot the sun. As I moved deeper, the temperature rose, fueled by geothermal veins, and the air took on a dry, parchment-like quality. I eventually entered a chamber so vast my flashlight beam could not find the ceiling. This was an archive, a silent gallery of a culture that had lived in parallel with our own since the dawn of time. I found gargantuan skeletal remains laid out on raised granite slabs with a reverence that spoke of complex final rites. The walls were adorned with handprints in red ochre and sequences of etched tallies that seemed to track lunar cycles over thousands of years. It became clear that they had been placing their departed here for centuries, a deliberate effort to ensure that no trace of their lineage would ever be discovered by the world above. They were not hiding because they were beasts, but because they understood us all too well. They had seen the expansion of our reach, and they had chosen the silence of the stone as their only defense. But as I turned to examine a wall covered in celestial maps, I heard a mechanical hum vibrating through the limestone. The surface world was drilling down, and they were closer than I imagined. Sarah's phone was a hollow digital void, and the laboratory was officially closed when I drove back into town. A local officer told me the building had been seized under an eminent domain order, but the men in radiation suits moving through the lobby were carrying computer towers, not decontamination equipment. They were scrubbing the record of the unknown primate from the physical world. I drove to the edge of the county and searched the base of a hollowed-out fence post. Tucked inside was an encrypted hard drive Sarah had hidden. When I finally accessed the files, the sheer scale of the deception became clear. Sarah had managed to bypass a secondary firewall, uncovering a series of internal memos dating back to the late 1960s. The government did not categorize these beings as animals. They had a specific, high-level designation: the first citizens. The data revealed that authorities had been tracking the lineage for over 50 years, mapping subterranean corridors to prevent public interaction. They were not hiding the creature to protect it, but to protect the status of our own biological sovereignty. As I scrolled through the stolen archives, I found a map marked with extraction zones and a tactical containment protocol. I was no longer just a witness. I was a liability in a cover-up that had silenced voices for decades. The federal agents brought in a heavy-lift helicopter equipped with a forward-looking infrared pod that hummed like a hornet over the valley. I stood on the jagged edge of the north wall, watching the spotlight sweep the granite, as I realized I had to make a choice. I could either let them capture a living legend, or I could help the mountain swallow its secrets. I moved with a desperate speed, utilizing my knowledge of the terrain to lead the ground team away from the true entrance of the cavern. I navigated toward a natural electromagnetic dead zone, where the magnetite in the rock causes sensors to glitch. As the strike team closed in, their high-tech headsets crackled with interference, and the helicopter above struggled to maintain its orientation in the thin, turbulent air. The mountain seemed to pulse, the ground vibrating until a roar erupted from the peak, a sound so massive and ancient that it felt like the earth itself was screaming in defiance. The sound wave was a physical force, shattering the glass of the helicopter's searchlight and sending a cascade of boulders down the slope. In that moment of absolute chaos, the electronic systems of the tactical team went dark. I caught a glimpse of a massive silhouette standing atop the highest crag, a guardian watching the retreat of the modern world. The ridge had held its ground, but the cost of this victory was higher than I had ever imagined. I am back on my porch now, watching the sun set over the hidden valley. The lab report has been reduced to grey ashes in my fireplace. The black vehicles have retreated, and the mountain is quiet again. I know that the silence is not an absence of life, but a sophisticated ancient form of protection. I can never reveal the exact longitudinal coordinates of that limestone crevice. The evidence I gathered, the vials, the recordings, and the stolen data, has been buried in a place where no shovel will ever find it. I have seen the face of a world that exists in the periphery of our own, a civilization of first citizens who chose the depths of the earth over the chaos of our light. But there is one detail from Sarah's final report that I cannot burn away. The genetic analysis of the saliva identified a rare ancestral marker that has appeared in only 3 known lineages in the history of the Rockies. One of those markers belongs to my own family tree. The connection suggests that the boundary between us and them is not a wall, but a thin, permeable membrane of shared history. Every night, I listen to the rhythmic knocks echoing from the timber. I am the guardian of a truth that rests in the marrow of my own bones. The mountain is still exhaling, and somewhere in the dark, My brothers are waiting for the stars to align. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the stone, yet they breathe in the silence long after we leave the trail. If you're ready to follow the evidence deeper into the unknown, subscribe and leave a link to join our next expedition. Share these findings with the few who still look toward the tree line with wonder, because the more we uncover, the more we realize we aren't alone. Watch the shadows closely, for the first citizens are still out there, and they are watching back.